Hello, and welcome to this next instalment of my series on Druid meditation and looking at meditation from the perspective of Druidry, and this from the perspective of the ancient British peoples, the Celts, going back many millennia in the British Isles. So what I wanted to talk about today specifically was the realm of what's known as the Otherworld, or to use the ancient Brythonic word, which is also still in use in Welsh today, the word Annwfn, which is Annwfn. It's actually spelt in our modern language today, but it's pronounced Annwfn. Sometimes you'll see it referred to as Annwn, Annwn, but the version that I'm going to use today is the word Annwfn, which is more specifically used in sort of the classical Brythonic language. And the definition of this word literally means the very deep inside. So it's a place of it's a place known to generally across sort of Celtic mythology as the Otherworld, and it's seen as a place which is not at all like the Judeo-Christian idea of a sort of a heaven type of place. It's seen more as almost like a sort of a parallel realm to this realm. But I will show you why it might be sort of seen almost as a sort of a heavenly realm. So the belief is that there is another world which is alongside this world, and it is a realm which was seen by the Celts to be inhabited by, first of all, the spirits of the dead who had passed on from this life. Their spirits had passed into this world, but it wasn't seen as a realm where they would stay permanently or indefinitely, because the ancient Celts did believe in reincarnation, which was very interesting to me. Because I have studied meditation and I've studied a lot of the Eastern traditions, the yogic traditions, the Buddhist traditions, and the Taoist traditions particularly. And of course they all have this sense of a reincarnation. So they don't have this sort of Judeo-Christian idea that we live one life and after that there is some sort of judgment and we either go to a good place or a bad place, heaven or hell. That is not understood in most religious, spiritual, philosophical, mythological traditions throughout the world. So it was interesting to me because with my own personal journey, I wanted to get back to the roots of the traditions that are in the lands where I live. And I live in the United Kingdom. I live in England, near the border with Wales, the middle part. So I'm in the region that thousands of years ago would have actually been, this part of Shropshire would have actually been in Wales. It would have been in the kingdom of Powys at one time, Powys, which was a kingdom which sort of spread right through the middle section of Wales, from the Irish Sea coast all across to what's known as the Midlands today. And so over the many years and millennia and different sort of invasions that we've had from the Romans, Anglo-Saxons, Normans, etc., all the borders have changed a lot. So the border that we have today with sort of England, Scotland, Wales. This has kind of evolved, should we say, and moved quite a bit. But to go back to what I'm saying, there was a sort of a common language amongst the Celtic people, and it's certainly in the British Isles, and which originally the oldest name that we have for it is Brittany, which not dissimilar to Britain, only with a P. And so we had the people in sort of Brittany on the west coast of France there, and we had the same, they were the same sort of Celtic peoples there in that part of the world that would have settled the British Isles and been there. So when I say that this word for the other world, Annwfn, was a Brythonic word, that is also to say that it's in use in the Welsh language today, because the Welsh language is a revived language. In pockets of Wales, Welsh was spoken sort of throughout the ages, but the modern sort of structured version of Welsh now has been sort of revived. So there are now more Welsh speakers than there would have been in Wales, and there would have been certainly 50, 100 years ago, which is wonderful. It's wonderful to know that there is that resurgence and that people want to get back to their roots. And indeed my surname, Floyd, though it's not exactly like the Welsh Llwyd, but it's been seen as being almost like a transliteration, almost like the English people not being able to pronounce the double L sound, which makes that sh sound. So it's been sort of transliterated into the F sound, so Floyd. So in actual fact, it's quite interesting that there are a lot more Floyds over the other side of the Atlantic in the Americas than there are in the British Isles today. It's not a particular common name, but I'm interested because somewhere in the history of my family, then that name has come probably from, either it's come from the Welsh or it's come from the ancient Brythonic languages. Llwyd meaning grey, so you know you can sort of tell my hair sort of lost its colour a long time, many decades ago, and I'm in my late 50s now, but you get the idea. So there's an element there that I am interested in my own ancestry, and you know, so it was interested studying all of these different traditions from the East, but it's very interesting to me as well to come back and find the history of the British Isles and find out that a lot of the things that are taught in the Eastern world were quite similar to many of the things that were taught here by the Celts and by the Druids in particular, who were the priest caste of the Celts. And a lot of the things they understood to be very similar to a lot of the things that came out of the India and Asia and that sort of part of the world as well. So yeah, so as much to say that the idea of reincarnation was very much taken as granted that was the case. And as I mentioned last time, there's this idea of the three stages of birth, death and rebirth, and we see the number of 3 in the Celtic tradition is a very important number, very sacred sort of number. So Annwfn, to come back to Annwfn, literally means the very deep or the very deep inside, and there's a sense that this land of Annwfn, or the other world as it's known generally across the Celtic regions, that it's kind of, in some ways, it's kind of underneath this land, that that are somehow underground inhabitants, which kind of live under the ground in some senses, but in other senses and in other tales of folklore, it's seen as almost like a parallel dimension, if you like, a parallel realm to this realm. So it could be reached, unlike a place like heaven or some of the places in some of the other mythologies like Valhalla and some of the Norse pagan sort of places, which were only reached sort of after this life. The sense from the ancient Celtic, the British, Welsh traditions was that Annwfn is a place that could actually be visited by mortals, that they could go there, they could visit there, gain things like wisdom and knowledge from this area, and that they could come back into the mortal world afterwards. Now, one of the unusual things I'll go into in a little bit is that often time didn't pass in the same way that it does in this realm. The time was somehow altered and different. But the realms of the otherworld, Annwfn, were very beautiful, very rich sort of places where food was plentiful, certainly in an era thousands of years ago when one had to go out and literally hunt for food or toil the land, etc. Then this was a place of feasting, it was a place of relaxing, banqueting, that sort of thing. And it was a very pleasant place to be. There's a sense, as I said, with it being a sort of an underworld almost, that those that describe it in folklore describe it there being a sort of almost a different sort of light in this area, like a sort of an ethereal light. So it's not quite daylight, it's almost as if the sun and the moon don't light this place, but it's lit by some kind of magical ethereal light. That's in some particular traditions, but as I said, it's also possible to see in other mythological tales that people literally slip into this world, maybe by enchantment, maybe they are invited across, which is usually the case, by the inhabitants of this world. But it is certainly possible to go into that place. We spoke last time about the Annwfn, which is that source of spiritual, divine energy that flows through us, very similar to chi or prana energy, but with the element of inspiration running through it as well. So it's that energy that flows through us, but also inspires us, inspired the prophets, inspired the poets, the bards, the storytellers and the musicians. And modern Druids today would see very much as the Annwfn as being something which inspires them to write their poetry, their music, etc. So that's a very important element of it. And in some senses, those that would pass over into the other world, into Annwfn, would go there in many instances in order to receive this inspiration, this Annwfn sort of inspiration. So that's another important thing to note. So what of the people that live in this other world? It's not just an empty place where mortals go into, but it has its own certain residents, its own denizens, people that live there. And we could break those down into a number of different categories. I mentioned the spirits of dead humans would pass into there and spend a certain amount of time, and that time was almost seen as a time of rest, recuperation and readiness before they were then reincarnated into a new form, whether that be human, animal, etc. That's one category of people of beings that we would find there. Apart from that, we would also find what are known as the fair folk. We might think of them as fairies, though I will explain the fact that our modern term fairies doesn't exactly equate with what the traditional form is. There are also known to be sort of rulers of this area that would seem to be humanoid in appearance, not exactly different from us, but there were distinct differences, so that if one were to see one of these inhabitants, though ostensibly they would seem to be normal human beings, they would have certain other ethereal, magical sort of properties or appearances to themselves in that sense. So to go back to the fairies, if you like, the fairy people, the fair folk as they're known, this is a common motif that's found across all the Celtic world. Very common, lots of stories from Ireland. I'm not going to go into the Irish traditions at the moment. I'm looking more at the ones on the big island, if you like, where I am now, which is Great Britain. So the larger island, we have our own versions of these stories, and certainly we have tales that come back all the way from the time of the Druids and the Celts. So what are these fairies, if you like? What are these fair folk? Well, they're smaller people, but they're not. So our modern conception of what is a fairy is this little tiny, a doll-like woman, little girl type figure that could kind of sit in the palm of your hand. She's very beautiful, with a sort of tinkly voice, and she's got these gossamer thin wings, rather like a butterfly or an insect, and she kind of flits around from flower to flower in the garden. Okay, I want you to completely forget that idea, because that is an idea that was created largely in the 19th century. It was a romantic reimagining of what a fairy was. So I'm sorry if that offends anybody in any way. That's their conception of what a fairy is. But this was not the traditional view of what the fair folk, the little people, were from the ancient times, going back 2,000-3,000 years before the Common Era. What we're talking about here is a race or various races of rather diminutive humanoid type creatures, beings. So we're talking about probably the size of small children, but certainly not the size that would kind of sit on the palm of your hand. There's not really any mention of such tiny sort of figures of that, and not particularly really any mentions of anybody having wings either. This is kind of a modern myth that's grown around sort of some of the art and paintings that were created in the 19th century. And there was a classic case of hoaxing where in the early days of photography, some images were kind of superimposed onto some photographs of these kind of tiny little women with wings, etc., which was kind of half believed by a lot of people at the time, but was later on found to be a hoax, if you like, an early example of photoshopping. But I digress. So the little people, if you like, as they're known in Ireland, certainly, but they are smaller often, but these are by no means the entirety of what the fair folk are. There are also ones who are tall. If you are familiar with the stories from Tolkien, and certainly the films of Lord of the Rings and this series of films, you'll remember the elves were sort of tall, blonde, almost Nordic sort of looking figures, and certainly some of the depictions of the fair folk are like these taller beings as well, who look very human, but they do have this kind of ethereal, sort of magical sense to them. Again, there's not particularly any mentions of them having pointed ears. Again, that's a bit more of a modern thing. I'm sure it must have come from somewhere, that idea, but it's not really something that's recorded in our particular folklore here in the British Isles. We're just talking about various races of humanoid type beings that inhabit this other realm, this other world, known in the ancient languages as Annwfn. And they live there. They have their hierarchy of kings and princes and nobility there, certainly. And they have other beings as well. Some of these beings are quite sort of helpful to humans, although there's more of a sense of an indifference mostly, rather than being sort of keen to help humans. They kind of, and there is a certain sense that anyone that does go across into these worlds needs to be respectful of these beings that are there. And there are also accounts of very mischievous beings, very mischievous kind of little people that would come into the category of the fair folk, the fairies, such as, you know, the brownies and the imps, the goblins, all of these sort of tales of creatures. They're known by many different terms. Some of them are mischievous, some of them often play tricks and pranks on human beings. Now, as I said, it's almost like this realm is running parallel to the world that we are familiar with. And there are liminal spaces, in other words, places between worlds, between dimensions, where it is possible to cross over. And the Celts were familiar with these places, and they would be places like the edges of water. So maybe a riverbank where the bank met the river would be a place where possibly there could be a transition from this dimension to that. Maybe the seashore. It may be a mountain or a hill. Certainly the Raths of Ireland, going back to Ireland, were seen as mounds inside which the fair folk, the fairy folk lived. But that's only one of those many traditions. But the idea is that there are areas, magical sort of places. It could be in some sort of woodland, glen or area where that takes place. And there is a sense that these fair folk, when they have interactions with human beings, they can be good and not so good. And there are tales of things like human beings being taken. Certainly babies is a common one. The whole theme of the changeling, the child that's taken when it's quite small, taken into this other world, Annwfn, and exchanged for a fairy child, which is brought and left with the mother, and then that child being, you know, very troubled in certain ways, maybe a bit of a handful, maybe a bit mischievous, being different from other children, etc. That is quite a common theme going through the folklore of our sort of fairy tales, if you like. But that's not to say that always happens, but that is one of the things. Another thing that's noted when human beings pass over into the other world is that time doesn't pass in the same way there as it does here. That there is a change of the passing of time. So maybe a person might go into the other world and it might seem like they're there for a short period of time, but when they return back to this mortal realm, they find that a long period of time, maybe decades, has gone past, but it seemed like only a short time. The other side of the coin is that sometimes, conversely, a person can go into that realm and it can seem like they spend maybe years there, a long period of time, but when they come back into the mortal realm, people have hardly noticed that they've been away. They've been away such a short period of time. And some of these things I will mention again in a short period of time, because a short period of time, yeah, okay, I get the irony of that, but I will mention that again because it draws to mind other parallels with other things that we might talk about from the paranormal, should we say. Apart from it being this magical parallel dimension, this mystical place, there is also a certain sense that's believed by a lot of people that this other world, Annwfn, whatever you want to call it, is a place that's deep inside of us as human beings. Now, from a perspective of a meditator, where we believe in going deep within ourselves and finding our true self on the inside, and if we look at the yogic traditions and the and the stories from the Hindu culture, we see that this figure of Brahman sits seated inside the heart. So there is almost this kind of other realm within us as well, where our true self dwells. So that's one way of looking at it. That's not to say that one has to be exclusive of the other, that you either believe it's inside you or you believe it's a parallel realm. There is a sense that because time and space are different, that it's possible to maybe enter into other dimension by going inside the self, by going deep in there, that we can actually do that. And so the Druids are known for having taken these journeys of visualization, these almost shamanic type journeys where they would travel by means of magic, maybe potions. Maybe we remember the story of Ceridwen and her potion of Annwfn. Then the Druids certainly had their share of magical potions and herbs and plants and things like this, and no doubt they would have used psychedelics as well, probably mushrooms, which are very prolific in the British Isles because of our climate. They grow naturally, and certainly in certain parts of Wales, things like psilocybin mushrooms are particularly prolific even today. Though through the wisdom of the British government, they were made illegal substances in the late 1960s. I won't go into that, but that is often seen as a means by which one can travel into these other realms. A little bit similar to the notions of some of the South American traditions of drinking things like ayahuasca, which transport the person into other dimensions, into other realms, altered states of consciousness, etc. So it's almost a sense that yes, it's a parallel world, yes, it's another dimension, yes, it runs alongside this one, but it's not to say that it's not possible to enter that by some sort of visualistic journeying inside the self. So for me as a meditator, that's particularly fascinating, the notion that one can do that. Now, when we look at the aspect, the concept of the third eye chakra from the yogic traditions, This is seen as as the seat of intuition and psychic abilities and connection with other dimensions, other realms, other states of consciousness. We looked last time at the story of Taliesin, the Shining Brow, he of the Shining Brow, and we looked at how that's a very similar story. You can see that the origins of those stories could have come from the same sort of belief system, if you like, which is common. Truth is truth wherever you go in the world. You know, if these things are true, then they're true. And then if we also look at some of the places where the Otherworld, Annwfn, is can be crossed over to accessed, could be deep in the forest in some of these kind of places like the Grove. So we had the Druids meeting in the Grove, which is a clearing in the forest, a sacred place, almost like a natural cathedral where they would meet. And this is a type analogous of the heart chakra, being that seen as a green colour, like the green of the forest, and being an open space, almost like a heart space within. So there's an analogy there between the heart chakra and the Grove as well. And the Grove is another of those liminal spaces through which one can pass into the other world and make connection. And by making connection, one can come back with wisdom and inspiration and knowledge from this world of other beings. So I'd like to tell you a little story which comes from our old mythology, and it comes from a Welsh tradition, first recorded, written down in the stories of the Mabinogi, which is a Welsh compendium of folkloric tales from the ancient Wales, which had been passed down orally, but was sort of written down several hundreds of years later. And this story concerns a certain Pwyll, who was the Prince of Druid, which is a sort of a southern part of Wales, makes up sort of part of South Wales today. And the story goes that he was a bit of a reckless young man, not particularly knuckling down to his duties in the royal court, etc. But he did like to hunt, and one day he went out into the forests in Druid, and on his horse, with his hounds, which had probably been greyhounds, or some sort of form of dog of that ilk, and as he was passing through the deep woodlands, towards him comes a stag, which is obviously, it's very tired, it's very weary, it looks like it's about to collapse, so it kind of staggers into the clearing in the forest there and falls, at which point Pwyll sends his hounds to the stag to kind of kill it, finish it off, and of course they are then feasting on the stag. The next thing that happens is a mysterious rider on a almost ethereal type horse, grey sort of horse, comes onto the scene in the clearing, and he's this rather brooding figure, and along with him come his own hounds, which are these white hounds which have red ears, and they come into the clearing, and the rider of this horse introduces himself as Arawn. who is a ruler in Annwfn. And he introduces himself as that, and he's very annoyed with Pwyll because he sees that he has taken the stag that his hounds and he was hunting. He chased the stag down, and they, as it were, had taken advantage of his kill of his stag that he'd been hunting. And he's very indignant. Pwyll explains that where he lives, and he considers this to be in his principality of Druid, that he's the ruler of this place, and therefore a proportion of every kill is his right. He is rightfully able to take some of this kill. Well, there's a bit of a disagreement between the two, and Arawn says that's not the way it works where I come from in Annwfn. In fact, it's very bad form that you should think that you can come and take something from someone else when it clearly belongs to them. They've done the work. They've hunted this this stag, and why should your hounds be able to have that first? And there's an exchange. Arawn's hounds do end up getting, feasting on the stag. Pwyll calls his hounds off, etc. And there's a bit of a disagreement between them, but Pwyll, realizing that this man on the horse is this powerful person, is one of the fair folk, has come from the region of Annwfn. He says, well, what can I do to make it right? How can we clear this up between us? And Arawn makes a suggestion that they exchange places, that Pwyll would travel in his place back into Annwfn, that they would change places, they would swap personas, if you like. So Pwyll would go into Annwfn looking exactly like Arawn, and Arawn would go back to Druid, to the courts there, where they would both spend a year and a day in one another's realm. So they agree upon this, and it's even said that Pwyll even has the right, Arawn says, to sleep with his wife, with Arawn's wife, while he goes into this place. And Pwyll isn't married at the time in the story anyway. But so they exchange places. Arawn goes to Druid, and it's said that he rules there, and he is very just, very fair, and he performs very admirably. People think that it's still Pwyll who's there. They don't realise that there's been a change, but they do notice the difference, the command, his manner, etc., and how he actually does his business is very good. But in the meantime, Pwyll is in Annwfn, and he's given the great garments and everything. He goes in there looking exactly like Arawn, but similarly, he makes a very good job of it. Now, the one stipulation that Arawn has made is that there is another king in Annwfn, so presumably a ruler of another part of Annwfn, who's called Annwfn. And now Annwfn and he have had this dispute, and they've made an agreement that they would have a battle at a certain time at a river's crossing, again being a liminal space, so the edge of the water, and that they would have a fight. Now, Arawn had explained to him that he must strike Annwfn only once, and if he struck him once, he would be killed. If he struck him twice, then he would recover and come back and be revived again. But to strike him once would kill him. So this also takes place, and the meeting does take place, and so here's Pwyll in the place of Arawn, meets with Annwfn at the river, and there they are armed combat together, and Pwyll in the form of Arawn strikes Annwfn, who falls to the ground, and Annwfn, according to the story, pleads with him and says, "Oh, I'm finished. Be so kind as to just strike me one more time, and it will be quick, and I'll be dead and gone more quickly, and it'll be more painless, etc. because you've nearly got me," kind of idea. But remembering what he was told by Arawn before he went there, he realises that this is a trick, and he does not strike him a second time. And so Annwfn realises that he's been outsmarted, and the enemy is vanquished. The enemy of Arawn is vanquished, and then after the period of time, a year and a day again, being that very noticeable time period, if you remember, the same as the period of time that Ceridwen's potion of the Annwfn had to be boiled for a year and a day. In the same way, this was a year and a day's exchange of the two rulers, and they go back to their respective places after their good friends. They've both acquitted themselves well in what they've done, and Pwyll has learnt a lot of good lessons, a lot of good skills, and he comes back to find that his kingdom has been ruled over in an exemplary manner by Arawn, who is this wonderful sort of king of the other world. So that's one of the stories about the other world, if you like. So you can see here that it's like another dimension, and that they almost sort of coexist with each other. That is one of the stories that we hear about that. I would say another thing that I want to mention is a little bit of a parallel, because the way that I got into learning about a lot of the spiritual practices and got into meditation and really saw the benefit of so many of these different spiritual traditions was actually through an interest in other paranormal sort of things, and one of those things which I studied in great depth and still very much interests me are stories about extraterrestrials, UFOs, flying saucers, UAPs as they are known now, and about the way encounters between humans and so-called non-human intelligence, non-human entities are described, and there are a lot of sort of common themes and motifs that we find in UFO folklore, which is like a modern folklore, and in fact we could almost transpose some of the stories about the fair folk and so-called aliens, extraterrestrials, because some of the interactions that people have described with these beings are not dissimilar in a lot of ways. So we've got things like missing time. There's a well-known book by a guy called Bud Hopkins about missing time, and about a study that he did with a number of people, often with hypnotic regression, where they would recount tales of being abducted or encountering beings who were often small people, again not tiny people that could sit on the palm of your hand, but small people, often described with this classical image of a small grey person. Often they're almost described in some cultures as being a bit like goblins or hobgoblins, which comes directly from our fairy folklore. So I say missing time is one of them. Being taken away and brought back, and time has not moved in the same way that it was. Many of the tales of the fair folk describe them flying in magical cars, magical vehicles, where they'll kind of not so much having wings like Tinkerbell, but being in some sort of flying machine, flying form of transport that enables them to sort of fly. We have the stories of fairy lights. Now, one particular story that I remember, which was known as the British Roswell. If you're familiar with the story of the legendary story of a supposed downed UFO in 1947 in a place called Roswell in New Mexico. I was going somewhere with this. There's a British version, or it's described as a British Roswell, not really particularly the same, but this case of a lights that was seen and a supposed strange object that was seen in a place called Rendlesham Forest, which is in the eastern part of England, in a place called East Anglia, around about where there are a number of American Air Force bases, and there were lights were seen in the forest. Well, again, this is something that's a common theme with stories of the fair folk, with fairies, lights seen in the forest, fairy lights, etc. Then we have the modern phenomena of the crop circles, which are very much like the old stories of the fairy rings which appear. People seeing fairies or lights going around in a circle, and they create these rings. And very similarly to that, the modern phenomena where lights are seen, almost orbs, etc., hovering over a field of crops, and then these intricate patterns are formed. So we have these parallels, if you like, with these stories, which intrigues me. And there's a famous scientist by the name of Jacques Vallée who wrote quite at length, drawing parallels between sightings of mythological creatures through the ages, through the millennia, through the centuries, and saying that they are very, very similar to modern encounters with what are supposedly extraterrestrials or alien creatures. We don't know what they are, and certainly we're at a time now where in the United States there is talk about the possibility of disclosure of potential government conspiracies, etc., about contact between humans and non-human intelligences. And these stories are very, very interesting because they do call to mind very much the similarities between those encounters with non-human intelligences and these ancient stories from our mythology about the non-human intelligences that come from the other world or Annwfn. And there are even stories in UFO folklore today, mythology, about there being hidden underground bases under the ground, particularly again in the United States. They're spoken of as being deep underground military bases where supposedly these creatures, non-human intelligences, may be interacting with human beings under there. As I say, it's as much folklore, it's as much become a mythology in modern times as the stories of the fairy folk, the fair folk were then. And in many parts of the world, these stories are still taken very seriously. So the question is there a correspondence between the two? I'm not going to say, I'm not an expert on it. I'm not going to say, yes, categorically, aliens, extraterrestrials are really fairies, or fairies are really aliens, extraterrestrials. I don't know. But I do believe that there is too much evidence of interaction with human beings with other entities, whether they be spirits, whether they be flesh and blood, other species of creatures, whether they be from another dimension or a different time. The speculation and the conjecture continues to this day, even in scientific circles. So that I find that very interesting, and I would like to at some point go into a story of my own where I had a sort of an encounter where there was missing time, and I did sort of see some sort of being or apparition, etc., involved with that. But I'll leave that for another time because I've gone on for quite a long time. But how then can we relate this to our meditation? Well, for me personally, as I said before, it's really important to know that when we study consciousness and when we study the nature of who or what we are, we realise that we are spiritual beings and that we are more than just, we are not our bodies, we are not our minds, we are not our thoughts, we are the consciousness, we are the conscious awareness. And we're looking out from these eyes, and as the belief was back then many thousands of years ago, so is the belief still held amongst many today, that we partially choose this life. We are incarnated into this particular form and we have a particular choice about that. If you go back to the stories of Annwfn, with the spirits of the dead being there for a certain amount of time in preparation for them to re-enter the mortal world in another form. We looked at shape-shifting, we looked at the story of Taliesin, where Gwion Bach got the Arawn potion and was able to transform into different forms. And we looked at that as being a type of reincarnation, if you like, and transformation in that sense. So for me personally, as a meditator, I am conscious of the fact that there is more to this existence than just the mundane, ordinary, mortal human being that you're seeing on your screen now. That I am an awareness. I am a multi-dimensional being, and I can travel between this reality that I see now, and as I enter into meditation, I can certainly have the possibility of reaching other states of conscious awareness where I'm not aware of my physical body. I'm not bound up by the constant chattering monkey mind of the brain, those thoughts that are coming in, and I can go to another deeper place. I could again tell you stories of journeys of visualization that I've made, where I have spoken to people like ancestors, family members, and had messages that I brought back, rather like those people that travelled across into the other world, into Annwfn, and came back with messages, with wisdom, with inspiration, and yeah. So I'm not going to go on much longer with this one because it's been quite a long one. This is probably going to be the second part of my message, unless I can work out how to splice these two videos together. But yeah, if you enjoyed this and you want to hear more, then you might consider subscribing to this channel. If you have any comments that you want to make, anything you want to share, or questions that you want to ask, do pop them in the comment box. If you enjoyed it, do give us a thumbs up. And I will speak to you next time with the next instalment of this story. Thank you very much. Annwfn.